Rain had just begun to fall when the door of the saloon burst open. A man stumbled out first, red-faced and furious, his hand clenched around a whiskey bottle. Then came the girl, pregnant belly straining under a soaked cotton dress shoved so hard she fell backward into the mud. Her scream was swallowed by the thunder. The man followed, boots splashing through the puddles, and with one cruel step he kicked her hard in the gut. She cried out, clutching her belly, curling like a wounded animal. A few folks across the street, shopkeepers, a deputy, even the preacher, watched from their windows. No one moved. No one stepped outside. "You filthy disgrace," the man roared. "You shame me in front of all God's people." He raised his hand again. She whimpered, shielding her head. And then came the click. Sharp, deliberate, clean. A revolver being cocked. The man froze. Slowly he turned, standing at the edge of the boardwalk. Hat low over his eyes was a man in a duster. Silent. Still. His right hand held a drawn pistol, steady as if welded from iron. "Back away," the stranger said, voice low as thunder rolling over dry plains. The drunk hesitated, confused, then took one half-step forward. The revolver jerked upward, a warning twitch. "I said back away." The man cursed under his breath, tossed the bottle into the mud, and staggered back inside. The woman sobbed into her hands, mud and blood mixing beneath her. The cowboy holstered his pistol, stepped into the rain, and helped her up without a word. All around them, windows closed, doors locked. The street held its breath. Eli Mercer hadn't been inside a church, a town hall, or a family home in nearly 7 years. Folks whispered that he'd ridden with trail gangs back when cattle drove the economy, that he'd shot a man over a card game and walked off before the body hit the floor. Truth was, Eli hadn't killed in anger since the day he buried his wife and turned his back on the world. Now he lived 3 miles east of Sagebrush Junction in a cabin tucked between scrub pines and a dried-up creek. He kept chickens, smoked his own meat, and spoke to no one except the mare he rode into town once a month for flour and bullets. Inside his cabin, on a nail above the hearth, hung a silver locket. The hinge was rusted, but the picture inside was clean, protected by the years. A girl's face, 5 or 6 years old, with a red ribbon in her hair. Emma, the back of the locket read, "Scratched by his own knife on the night he last saw her." He hadn't known where she'd gone. Her mother had taken her during the storm of their marriage's collapse. When the letter arrived from Kansas City saying mother and daughter were dead in a house fire, Eli rode out and found only ashes and a neighbor who swore he'd seen a little girl carried away from the blaze by a stranger. After that, Eli stopped looking. He told himself she was gone. It was easier than believing she was alive and beyond his reach. Now back in the present, his hands trembled slightly as he lit the stove. The girl he'd pulled from the mud, he hadn't asked her name. Just rode beside her in silence as she clutched her belly and bled into the saddle. She hadn't spoken either, except to ask if she could lie down when they reached the cabin. He nodded and showed her the cot near the stove. She hadn't asked if he was dangerous. Maybe because any man who pulls a gun to save a woman in public isn't the worst kind of dangerous. Or maybe she didn't care anymore. Her breath was slow now, chest rising beneath a patched quilt he'd found in a trunk. Her shoes sat by the fire, cracked open at the toes. Mud still caked her hairline. Eli sat in the old rocker, one hand resting on his knee, the other on the Winchester across his lap. His eyes flicked to the locket. Emma would have been about her age now, he guessed. 22, 23. The girl stirred in her sleep, brow furrowed like she was running from something in a dream. He studied the curve of her jaw, the small scar under her chin. Familiar, faintly. Enough to make his chest ache with something like memory. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with her, but for the first time in years, the silence in the room felt too loud. The fire cracked. Outside, the rain gave up and left the land to its quiet. Inside, a man sat staring at a silver locket, a woman slept beside a burning stove, and the world tilted just slightly as if beginning to turn again. She woke in the half-light of morning, her eyes flickering beneath the heavy weight of pain and unfamiliar shelter. For a few seconds she lay still, watching the rafters above, listening to the wind scrape against the boards. Her hand went to her belly and her breath hitched. The child still moved. She exhaled slow and shaken. Then she sat up and looked around. The man was gone. The fire had burned down to coals, and beside the cot was a folded wool coat and a chipped tin mug of water. She drank greedily, water running down her chin, then wiped her mouth on her sleeve. Her wrists bore old bruises, finger marks that faded from purple to green, and a smear of dried blood from where she'd fallen. She looked around again. A single chair, some shelves with canned food, a rifle hanging on nails, and a silver locket above the hearth. She squinted at it. The face inside looked like someone she remembered in a dream. Blurry, young, held in place by grief. The door creaked. She flinched. Eli stepped in carrying a small burlap sack and a bundle of kindling. He said nothing, just glanced at her and gave a slight nod before walking past to the stove. "Why'd you help me?" she asked. Her voice rasped from thirst and fear. Eli crouched by the fire and said nothing for a long time. Finally he replied, "You looked like someone who hadn't been helped in a long while." She blinked. "You ain't a preacher, are you?" "No, ma'am." He set the kindling and coaxed the fire back to life. "Name's Grace," she offered. He didn't look up. "You can stay a few days. Got some cornmeal beans. Ain't much, but you need rest." Grace pulled the quilt tighter around her. "My stepfather. He'll be looking." "Let him look," Eli said. Then more gently, "He ain't got a reason to come this far out. And I got a reason to keep you safe." Grace watched him. "What reason's that?" Eli stirred the fire. "Don't know yet," he said, voice low. She didn't press him. Over the next 2 days she moved slow but steady. Her limp improved, the color returned to her cheeks, and she asked more questions. He answered few. She learned he used to ride trails, that he didn't go to town unless he had to, that he knew how to stitch a wound shoot from 200 yards and make cornbread with ashes if the flour ran out. In return, she told him things in pieces, about her mother dying slow in a back room without a doctor, about a man who wore a sheriff's badge one year and lost it the next for gambling and fists, about a gang that rode through Kansas looking for someone who owed them and how they left more blood than words behind. She didn't say who the father was. He didn't ask, but each time she winced, he brought her water. When she cried in her sleep, he sat by the stove and waited for the tremors to pass. On the third night, she took the silver locket from above the hearth while he was outside. She opened it, stared at the face. Something in her cracked, soft and painful. She traced the name on the back. Emma. Her lips moved over it, barely a whisper. Then she placed it back exactly as it was and said nothing when Eli returned. But that night she dreamed of fire and a little girl being carried into smoke by arms she couldn't see. The trouble came with dust and laughter, wrong kind of laughter. On the 5th day after Grace arrived, the Ashridge boys rode into Sagebrush Junction like they owned the soil. 7 men dressed in black dusters and sun-cracked boots, each carrying long rifles and sidearms like jewelry. They chewed tobacco and stared down shopkeepers. They took whiskey from behind bars without paying, but they didn't come for drink. They came asking about a girl. The leader, Victor Sloan, was a broad man with one blind eye and a scar that ran from temple to jaw like God tried to erase him and failed. He rode a dapple gray horse and carried a custom-made revolver with his initials carved into the ivory grip. "Name's Grace," he told the deputy with a sneer. "About 20, hair like honey and a belly like a melon. She ran off from my household. Stole something sacred." The deputy, chewing the inside of his cheek, tried not to tremble. "Ain't seen her," he said. "Can't help you." "You seen a man?" Sloan asked. "Tall, weathered, walks like a trail boss, lives out past the pines, could be anyone." "Ain't anyone." Sloan's voice dropped. "He's got my property." The Ashridge boys fanned out through town, asking more questions, buying bullets, spitting on wooden porches. One of them kicked a dog for barking too loud. Another slapped a young man who asked too many questions. And all the while, Victor Sloan waited, watching, measuring. Back at the cabin, Eli knew before he saw them. The way birds went silent, the stillness in the wind. He stood on the porch with a spyglass, spotted the dust rising from the east road. 7 riders moving slow, heads high. He didn't move. Inside, Grace stirred her tea with a trembling hand. It's them, ain't it? Likely, Eli said. What are we gonna do? He looked at her. You trust me? Don't know, she said truthfully, but I'm still here. He nodded. That night he packed quietly, shells in rows, knives oiled. He gave her a saddlebag and told her to keep it ready. They come here, I'll buy you time, he said. There's a trail runs west past the dried creek bed. You take it. Don't stop. You'll die, she whispered. Might. I won't leave you. You will, he said, voice firm. Because what's inside you matters more than what's inside me. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head. They ain't just after me. Eli looked at the fire. No, he said. They're after something I lost a long time ago. In town, Sloan waited one more day. Then he called his men to the livery and mounted up. She's out there, he said, grinning, and he's protecting her. Man like that don't do nothing for free. They reached the cabin by dusk. The place looked empty, chickens loose, door ajar, no smoke from the chimney. Sloan raised a hand signaling silence. The boys dismounted, moved in careful. One crept to the barn. Another flanked the outhouse. Sloan stepped onto the porch boots, silent on the boards. Inside, nothing. Just a warm stove and an empty cot. Then a voice from the trees. Drop your rifles. The Ashridge boys spun around. A shot cracked. One man dropped gut shots, screaming. The rest scrambled, ducking behind logs and brush. Eli fired again from higher ground. They couldn't see him. He moved like a ghost through the woods, firing from different angles, drawing them away from the house. Come on out, Mercer Sloan bellowed. You think this ends with you winning? Another shot answered. This one clipped Sloan's shoulder. He roared, took cover. You think this is about that girl? Hell, I could buy 10 more like her. Silence. Then Eli's voice, calm and cold. But only one carries your name. Sloan's face twisted. You shut your mouth. She's got your eyes, Eli said. Same curl in the lip when she lies, but she didn't lie about you. The night exploded. Gunfire, yelling. The Ashridge boys pushed forward. Eli kept moving, bleeding from a nick on his arm, legs heavy from age and rage. He didn't care. He led them deeper into the brush, away from her. One by one they fell. A knife in the dark, a tripwire across a narrow path, a bullet through the eye. When only 2 remained, Sloan called retreat. They galloped back toward the cabin, but Eli was waiting. He stepped into the clearing, shotgun raised. She ain't yours, he said. Never was. Sloan drew fast, but Eli was faster. The blast lit the dusk and Sloan fell, blood blossoming from his chest. The last man turned and ran. Eli didn't chase. He fell to one knee, breathing ragged. Blood soaked through his shirt. He looked west toward the dried creek. Run, girl, he murmured. Run far. Then he dropped the shotgun and darkness took him for a time. The pain came in pulses, sharp and white like hot nails driven beneath the ribs. Eli woke to the scent of pine needles and dried blood. A crow perched nearby let out a caw, a ragged note that matched the tear in his side. He pressed a hand there, felt warmth, and knew the slug hadn't passed through. He should have been dead. Maybe he was. But the sound of hooves in the distance snapped him back. Not a dream. Not yet. Grace had run just like he told her. But how far could she get on foot, belly full with child and no weapon to speak of? Eli cursed under his breath, forced himself up with a groan that tore from somewhere primal. He tore a strip from his shirt, packed the wound, cinched it with a belt. The world spun, but he stayed upright. There was one horse left, Sloan's gray, still tethered near the porch. The others had scattered or lay rotting in the woods. Eli limped toward it, gritting his teeth, and swung into the saddle with a prayer whispered between bloodied lips. He rode hard, following the western trail, scanning the dust for tracks. Grace had listened. Her footprints were there, faint but steady, weaving along the creek bed like a ribbon unraveling from a spool. He followed them past the old fence line, past where coyotes howled in early light. Her saddlebag lay discarded beneath a mesquite tree. Nearby, a strip of cloth-torn dress. And then voices. He dismounted silently, leading the horse around a bend. Below, in a shallow ravine, Grace crouched cornered. The last Ashridge man, Brill the youngest, held her by the arm, pistol drawn. He was bleeding from the shoulder, his face wild with desperation. "You're coming back," he barked. "He's dead. They're all dead, but I'll trade you in, get my cut. You ain't worth dying for, a girl." "I'll scream," she said. "You think anyone's listening? You're alone out here. You think that old man saved you. He bled out in the dirt. He's bones now." Brill raised the gun. "You run again, I'll shoot the baby out of you." Eli didn't speak. He didn't shout. He aimed from 30 feet out and fired once. The bullet punched through Brill's neck, neat as threading a needle. The boy dropped like a sack, eyes still open, mouth twisted in surprise. Grace gasped, backed away, then turned to see Eli stumble forward, pale as bone, hand pressed to his side. "You're alive," she whispered. "Not for long," he muttered, kneeling beside her. His vision swam. He touched her arm, checking. "You all right?" She nodded, tears running down her cheeks. "Good," he said. "That's good." He swayed. She caught him. They stayed there a long while, wind tugging at the grass, blood soaking into the soil. Eli's breaths came thin and shallow. "You can't die," she said. "Not now. You're all I have." He smiled barely. "Then you got enough." Together they made it to an old hunting shack Eli remembered from his trail days. She supported him, staggering under his weight. Inside was nothing but a broken cot and a water barrel. She boiled moss and pine bark, pressed it to the wound, packed it tight. He drifted in and out for hours, fevered, muttering names she didn't know. That night a storm rolled in. She sat beside him, holding his hand. "Tell me something," she whispered. "Tell me the truth." His eyes fluttered open. "That locket," she said. "That girl. Her name was Emma." He nodded. "My mother's name was Margaret," Grace said. "Margaret Langley. She used to hum a song about the Colorado River when she was sad. I asked her once why she cried when she hummed. She told me she lost someone, and she loved but couldn't stay with." Her voice shook. "She never said your name. But I found a letter once hidden behind a mirror, addressed to Eli Mercer. It was never sent, just words, saying she was sorry. That you were right, but it was too late." Eli didn't speak. Tears streamed down his temples, soaking the cot. "She kept the locket," Grace whispered. "Gave it to me when I was 10. I never knew who it was from. Until now." Outside, the storm broke open and rain began to fall in sheets. Inside, a daughter knelt beside the father she never knew she had, holding his hand as lightning lit the room, and thunder answered like a gunshot from the heavens. Eli whispered. Emma. Grace leaned closer. "That was your name once," he murmured, "when you were little. Your ma called you Grace, but I held you after you were born. Called you Emma. For one whole night you were mine." She buried her face in his chest. "I remember a fire," she said. "Flames and shouting. I was pulled outside by a man. I think it was Sloan. I never saw Mama again, but I always wondered. I dreamed of a man holding me by a fire." Eli's fingers tightened around hers. "Because I never let go." The storm raged. Eli's breaths grew slower, weaker. Grace stayed with him all through the night, whispering stories of the past, of things they might have done. And in the early light, just before dawn, he closed his eyes for the last time, locket still in his hand. The sun rose over the pines without fanfare. Its light filtered through the cracks in the hunting shack like golden threads falling across Eli's face, peaceful now in death. Grace hadn't slept. She sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around her swollen belly. The silence was immense. Not empty, just full of everything unsaid. She opened the locket again. Emma's face stared back at her, that ribbon in her hair, that soft smile. Herself once, before everything burned. The back of the locket still held the name, scratched, imperfect, etched in a father's hand. In the saddlebag Eli had prepared for her, she found a rolled scrap of oilskin sealed with a bit of twine. A letter. She sat slowly, opened it, hands trembling. The paper was old, the ink faded but legible. "Eli, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I never had the right to write it. Maybe I'm too much a coward. But if I don't say these things somewhere, they'll rot inside me like the rest of me has. You were right. About all of it. About me, about how I ran. I told myself I left to protect her, but that wasn't it. I left because I couldn't face what I'd become. I let fear steer the horse and told myself it was love. Emma asked about you. Even when she couldn't say your name, I told her stories, some true, some too good for this world. I kept the locket. I told her she'd know what it meant someday. If she ever finds you, tell her this: I never stopped loving either of you. And I'm sorry I never stayed long enough to prove it. Margaret Grace read it twice, her breath catching both times. Then she folded it, placed it in the locket, and shut it. The pieces clicked together with a tiny sound like the closing of a life. She buried Eli near the old pine grove where the light came through strongest and the earth felt still. She marked the grave with stones and carved one word into the bark of the largest tree, Father. She stayed another day, spoke aloud to the grave, told stories how she used to sit on rooftops pretending she was in the sky, how she stole honey from a merchant once and felt bad for a week, how the baby kicked when she heard fiddle music, things he'd never know, but maybe he heard them now. Then she saddled Sloane's horse, cinched her coat, and rode toward the valley. When she reached Sagebrush Junction, the townsfolk stared in silence. Mud still stained her dress. Her eyes held something deeper than grief, something that made grown men lower their gaze. She rode to the sheriff's office, tossed a revolver on the desk. That belonged to Victor Sloane, she said. The sheriff, a tired man named Hutch, picked it up carefully. He's dead, buried near the pines, she said, along with the others. You do it, my father did. Thought he was dead. He is now, she said softly, but not before he saved me. She turned and left without waiting for another word. Behind her, the street held its breath again. But this time, someone stepped outside. A boy no more than 12 raised his hand in silent salute. Then another. The silence broke not with sound, but with acknowledgement, and Grace rode through it like a ghost passing through memory. She found work at a small ranch west of the junction, trading her hands for bread and time. The child came 2 months later, a girl, born under a moon that hung like a silver coin in the sky. Grace named her Eli. The child carried something in her gaze, quiet strength, sadness born into her bones, but Grace smiled when she looked at her. Because there was hope there too. Hope that maybe the past didn't have to rot behind closed doors, that maybe it could be told like a story passed down by firelight. A story of a man who once pulled a girl from the mud, raised a gun to save her, and found his daughter in the eyes of a stranger. And sometimes on quiet nights, Grace would open the locket and read the letter aloud. She didn't do it for the baby. She did it for herself, to remember, to forgive, to keep the name alive, because names like bullets and prayers had to be carried carefully. And some things, some people you didn't lose. You just found them too late to keep. The pine tree stood tall above the grave, its limbs whispering in the wind. Snow would come soon. Grace could feel it in the air, in the way birds disappeared early, and the earth seemed to breathe slower. But for now, the autumn sun bathed the grove in soft gold, and she stood there with baby Eli swaddled against her chest, small breaths warm on her collarbone. She laid fresh wildflowers on the mound of earth, bluebonnets and dry sage, and sat for a long while watching the wind dance through the tall grass. The bark still bore the word she'd carved, Father. The knife mark had darkened over time, hardened, like a scar that healed not to forget but to remember. She hadn't spoken aloud to the grave in months. Words had grown harder as her daughter grew stronger. But today she found her voice. She took her first steps yesterday, she whispered. You'd have liked the way she marched. Didn't even look down. Just walked like she'd been waiting all her life for ground. The baby stirred, reaching a hand toward the sunlight that filtered through the pine branches. Grace kissed her forehead. I've been thinking, she said, voice tight, about where to go next. Maybe the mountains, somewhere quiet, somewhere with a school and no one who asks too much about names. She smiled faintly. But I'll always come back here. So she knows. She reached into her coat and pulled out the locket, polished now. She opened it, let her daughter see the face inside. That was me once, she said softly, and that man who found me. He gave me back my name, not because he had to, because he knew who I was even when I didn't. The baby babbled, pressing tiny fingers to the locket's face. Grace stood, brushed pine needles from her skirt. "Goodbye for now," she said to the grave. "Thank you for not dying angry. Thank you for dying trying." She placed the locket back around her neck and walked away. The child held close, two shadows stretching long behind them through the grass. Behind them the pine tree swayed, locket light flashing once like a tiny sun, and then all was still. Somewhere the wind carried the name Emma through the branches, soft like memory. And far away a child laughed for the first time, full of the sound of a name reclaimed. Some names get lost in dust and fire. Others, like Eli Mercer, carved themselves into bark and bone. Not with noise, but with sacrifice. Watch more true Western stories like this one, where blood and mercy walk the same trail. And don't forget to subscribe for the next ride.